And welcome back to Tabletop and Beyond. I am your host, Justin. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me on, Justin. I appreciate it.
No problem. As those who are watching will notice, we're missing Dan and Jason today. Jason is somewhere in the Caribbean, probably drinking something sweet on a beach. Dan had some emergency house things come up and couldn't make it tonight. So I think he'll be okay. It's just he's going to be moving a lot of things, it sounds like. So, but I am joined by you, Daniel. You are the author of Zweihander, the Zweihander RPG, using the Powered by the Apocalypse RPG system, and we're going to talk all about that today. And I'm super excited because I've recently discovered this, even though I heard about it a while ago.
Yeah.
So, very excited.
Yeah. Well, we're quick point of clarification. So it's
Yes.
powered by Zweihander, so we don't use the Apocalypse engine. We use our
Oh.
own game engine that we built in house several years ago. But I'm sure we're going to get into all that regardless.
Well, that is a point of clarification because for some reason I thought it was powered by the Apocalypse, and I am glad to know that it's powered by Zweihander. Even better. More to talk about.
Yeah, especially regarding the OGL stuff. That's going to be a fun conversation, I'm sure.
Definitely. And so again, thank you for jumping on the show with us. And as always, let's get into our Geek Week. So I'll start with the Geek Week just to kind of go through it a little bit. My Geek Week was kind of interesting. I play Warcry, which is a skirmish game by Games Workshop, and I have signed up for Adepticon to play there. That happens at the end of March, and I cannot figure out what kind of miniatures I want to bring with me, which is bad because everybody else has already an idea and they're playtesting and all that stuff, and I'm not. So I spent the weekend building some models. I got some little orcs here that I built, right? I need to paint them and all that stuff, but I built like 20 models, only going to use like 8 of them, and I still don't know if I'm actually going to use them. So, so that was fun. But I'm just kind of like going through thinking like, oh, what do I want to do? What do I want to do? But I love hobbying, and kind of building things and listening to podcasts and lore stuff and going through all those things while I'm making it, because it just is I've said several times on the show, it's my Zen moment where
Yeah.
I can just kind of like, go through it. So do you play any kind of tabletop skirmish games or miniatures or anything like that?
It's interesting you should ask that. I recently picked up the most recent copy of Blitzball, or Blood Bowl rather, the new
Blood
one.
Bowl. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it on the cheap at Barnes and Noble, and my dirty little secret about board games is I buy board games for figures. I typically don't play the board games, but
Nice.
I've been really drawn into Blood Bowl, having played the console version. So
Mm-hmm.
now I'm in the situation where I'm putting together my figures, but like anybody who buys figures, I haven't painted them, nor do I paint my figures, which my gaming group is like, you should paint your stuff. Like, hey, I'm so bad at it. I'm a terrible painter. My buddy Will, he builds terrain for us, and he's
Yeah.
like, he paints models, and he's like, just try your hand at painting. You do speed painting, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do it. So the question is, are you going to paint your minis that you just showed?
I do a lot of painting, and I don't have any painted one. I mean, I've kind of been working on like this Stormcast guy that you can see, right?
Uh-huh.
And I've got a bunch of other ones. So I'd love to paint. And that's really my Zen space,
Yeah.
where I can just kind of clear my head and do kind of a task that is kind of mindless but also engaging at the same time. It's
Mhm.
one of those rare things. And so it's funny you mentioned this, because our other show host Dan, for the longest time, said the exact same things that you did. Oh, I'm terrible at painting. I don't know that I
Mhm.
want to get into it. It doesn't really matter. And then he discovered speed paint, and now he's like engaged. Like he's
I love it.
probably painting more than I am at this point, and so
I,
yeah, he's
I'm
discovered his love of it.
I've got this distinct privilege of being friends with this guy Will. He goes by that effing GM, I think, on Twitter. And I started gaming with him like earlier this year. We actually met on Twitter, and he prints miniature terrain at home. It has like a massive collection. So instantly I was like, can I pay you to like build all my terrain, please? And now I have all this dungeon terrain and sewer terrain. And he's going to start working on city terrain soon. And you can't see it here. It's in the background, but I just got my sewer terrain from it. It's really, really cool. And then this week, I bought from Monster Fight Club, I bought the plastic rocks.
Oh yeah, look at those.
Yeah, these are really neat. I'm a big fan of their miniatures. Their tree miniatures are incredible. You can actually pull the tops of the trees off, so you can reach it with your figures. And because we record our games with a camera position down toward the grid because we play in person, the terrain that they create and the trees they make are super super cool. But my go-to guy is Will. He's the best guy ever. He just builds everything for us, and I love him for it. Now he's gonna custom print some figures for us too, I think, here for
Oh.
our weekly Zweihander game. So we're really stoked about that.
So I'm looking kind of over your shoulder a little bit, and that looks like it's
Mm.
your game table. You've got a bunch of shelves for miniatures. You got a bunch of shelves for books. If I'm, you got some kind of fantasy RPG artwork that's up on the walls.
Uh-huh.
This seems to be your dungeon, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
so I've blurred it out because what you can probably also see is that our Christmas decorations, we're currently going through our basement, the other side of the basement, so they're actually all in the game room right now. We're trying to like get rid of all this Christmas shit we've had for years. So
Yeah.
my game table is covered. But now this is our dungeon. We a buddy of mine, his mom built us this massive 800-pound 4x8 game table with these dinner drawers in it, and we play our tabletop games on top, so like our weekly Zweihander game, and then we play Darkest Dungeon, the board game, and we have that actually
Oh, that's a
inside
great
the
game.
table. Yeah, the leaves come off the top, and it's sitting on speed cloth. So this is both my home office and my dungeon. And I've got over here my Merkborg album
Yep.
with the adventure inside of it, and then my AD&D synthwave album inside it from like 1991, I want to say.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, I love the I have these old records. I don't know if you remember or not, but like Pizza Hut used to create these like little papery records that you could get with for like the
Oh
movies
yeah.
Gremlins, things like that. I
Yeah.
recently acquired some like that for like Dungeons and Dragons because much like what we're seeing right now with Wizards of the Coast, TSR was like trying to monetize their brand way back in the day. I found all these really interesting kind of like branded things. Like I have like the War Duke figure, I've got like some older
Huh.
records, and I just kind of got into this. This is just kind of a recent thing. I started getting into the hobby of collecting old D&D memorabilia, and my crowning piece of my collection is actually this little LCD screen. It's about the size of a credit card, and it's a
Yeah.
little dungeon game, and it's like made 1986. And
Whoa, that is
yeah, it's really
awesome.
really cool. Yeah, anybody who's listening or watching, you could probably find it. Just look up D&D handheld, and it's like a little burgundy console with two little gray buttons. It's the weirdest like collectible I've found so far in like the D&D market on eBay.
That's awesome. Just a little fun anecdote about that Darkest Dungeon game. I played the very first copy in the United States.
Really? Where
Yeah.
at?
So what happened is that my friend, he's actually my cousin, here in Virginia. He works for Mythic Games,
Oh, cool.
and dude, I don't know why, but my lights seem to be flickering and freaking out. But anyway, so my cousin works for Mythic Games, and he was going to Gen Con to demo Darkest Dungeon. This is like when I think it was still in the post. I don't know if the Kickstarter had quite closed by then, or
Mm,
I think it was maybe in post orders. Anyway, but he was going to Gen Con to demonstrate it, and we had the only copy in North America,
mm.
and we were playing it to test it out like 2 weeks before Gen Con. So that was pretty cool because I'm like, wow, like this is pretty legit,
Yeah.
testing it out. So I really like that game. It's a lot of fun.
We just wrapped up a year-long campaign for Kingdom Death, and when I received the Darkest Dungeon uh Kickstarter, which I bought, everything because I love the figures,
Yeah.
I love the design elements.
Yes.
We set it up back in late December, and we intended to play by now because we game every week. But between people being out of town, we have one of our gamers he's in Belize right now. One of our gamers, she's an attorney. She just had to unfortunately leave the game group, so we haven't had a chance to really crack into it, save for the demo adventure. But I will say, having played it, we unboxed it and played it over like 2 hours, and it was a
Yeah.
really smooth experience. I really liked it. It felt like the Darkest Dungeon video game, which is like if we can emulate the genre and emulate the game, like
Yeah.
I'm in. So
It's a
I'm
win
just I'm
for
just
sure.
absolutely in love with the figures, though.
Yeah, very good, very good. So how was your geek week? We talked a lot about all your geek stuff. How was your geek week?
Yeah. So gosh, it's a good question. I bought, like I said, I've been buying some new terrain. I started watching The Last of Us, which
Me too.
I missed last night's episode. In fact, I told my wife because
Okay.
my wife's not a gamer, but she will play video games with me. And the video games that she will play are only horror games because we're big horror aficionados. Like we love horror films, and she
Yeah.
loves horror video games. So we played through Last of Us, and she didn't play very far. We got to, I think, Boston, like so not very far into the game itself.
Okay.
So now we're watching the TV show, and the first
Yeah.
episode, of course, is just mind-bogglingly good. And I've
Yeah.
had to mute all the hashtags on social media so that it
Yeah.
doesn't get spoiled for us. So I told her, I said, after I get off this interview tonight, I swear we're going to sit down at like 10 o'clock at night and we're going to watch it because we're
Yeah.
super stoked for the next episode.
I watched it last night. I was at a dinner thing with some friends, and I got home and ended up watching it. And man, it did. So first off, it doesn't disappoint. Okay, I'm not going to
Yeah.
give any spoilers. It doesn't disappoint. But the second thing that I want to say about that show, and you probably got this from the first episode, but even more so in the second episode, they know how to do horror. The showrunners of that show
Yeah.
know how to do horror. Man, they ramp you up, they bring you back down. They ramp you
Mhm.
up, they bring you back down. And I mean, there's moments where I'm like gripping the seat, and I'm like, it reminds me of how I felt like for in the first season of The Walking Dead.
Mhm.
Like that was so compelling that first season. And Walking Dead has over 10 seasons, it's gonna have its issues and things like that.
Mhm.
But that first season was so compelling, like you just wanted to keep watching. And at the same time, like it was just really good, like horror stuff, and so
Yeah.
I think The Last of Us has some phenomenal actors in it. I think it's really well written. It's got a great concept, obviously, that worked really well for the video games. And I hope we can see more quality video game crossovers because we
Yeah.
just haven't had a ton. Like you've had a
No.
ton of crossovers, but not a good quality ones.
Yeah. That's so I loved so the showrunner, not Neil, I think his name is Neil Druckmann, but the guy who did
Mhm.
Chernobyl for HBO,
Yes.
is the one who initially I think pitched in as one of the showrunners on this. And that show was depressing. But more importantly, they're really good at like pacing. And I think that the
Mhm.
story beats that I saw, even without, even coming at it completely objectively, at The Last of Us, like as a standalone series, assuming it's disconnected from the game itself, it's a really good story so far.
Yeah.
I know that they've changed some of the story, I think probably for the better. But we'll see what happens this season. I have no doubt that I won't be disappointed. My friends have said you have to watch it immediately. They're stuck in, and these are people who don't play video games. These are people who are just like
Yeah.
into The Last of Us or into that films that are kind of like feel almost like a Cormac McCarthy novel, which is one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I love The Last of Us because it was so comparable to The Road. But nonetheless, yeah,
So
that's my geek week.
yeah, no, that's really good. It's funny you say this. So I have this wild hair. My brother gave me his PS4 when he got a PS5. And I didn't have a PS4 before, so I have never played The Last of Us.
Mhm.
So I'm coming into this fresh, right?
That's
And so
great.
I know it's awesome. And I kind of have this wild hair of going and playing the game, like watching the episode and then playing the game up to that point. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? And just kind of seeing like, oh, this is different, this is stuff, and then just kind of writing about it a little bit, maybe putting it on our social media or website or something like that.
Yeah.
But what I did do is I went back and I reread The Road
Mhm.
just last week.
Yeah.
And man, that book is something else. You know what I
It
mean?
really
Like
is.
it's something else because it's like it's so simplistic in a
Mhm.
sense, right? There's not like there's not a lot that happens or that goes on, and the dialogue is very minimal, right? Like
Yeah.
the when the characters are talking to each other, it's like one line sentences
Yeah.
and almost as few syllables, and you just kind of get this feeling of like they're trying to conserve energy even in the way that they talk.
Yeah.
Like and it just puts this like muted like depression like that you feel, right? Like there's not a lot of like flourish and that you would
Yeah.
expect in the normal living world, right? Like this is a post-apocalyptic just state of depression, it seems
Ha
like.
have you read Blood Meridian,
I
book that
have
he
not
wrote?
yet.
It's excellent, and it is, even though it takes place in America, it kind of has the same approach. I always referred to Cormac McCarthy as the E. E. Cummings of authors. Like, he's got
Mhm,
this very particular style that he writes in, of his work. And I love the movie The Road, but I'd read Cormac McCarthy well before The Road
mhm,
came out, and I think his best book is Blood Meridian, but it's a western,
mhm,
and it's creepy and weird and horrifying. And if you close your eyes, you ignore the fact that it's in America, it feels like a post-apocalyptic book,
mhm.
because the way that he writes and the stories that he tells, I highly recommend it. But yeah, I think that, The Last of Us is, I can't think of any other video game to television show that has succeeded. Although I think we have had a very scant few video games, or sorry, television show or movies turned into video games that worked. Um,
Mhm.
I'm thinking specifically of a game called Escape from Butcher's Bay, based off of Pitch Black, that Vin Diesel movie, which
Oh,
is
yep.
the original movie. It's not great, but the game Escape from Butcher's Bay is incredible. It's and I love the setup. It's essentially, you're trapped into prison. Now you have to work through the politics of living into prison to escape the
Oh,
prison. And
cool. Yeah, yeah.
it's all first person. It's slightly, it's a horror game, survival horror, and it's got role playing elements. But I was thinking about that when I was thinking about the Last of Us, because I was trying to think about like movies that turned into video games that were successful. It's the only one I can think of off the top of my head that actually was.
Yeah.
It was a cult sleeper hit. It's actually a really well written game, despite the fact that it has Vin Diesel playing, you know, Vin Diesel in it. But
Yeah.
yeah, I can't think of anything else that been made from video game to movie, or movie to video game that has succeeded, save for those two titles.
Yeah, I mean, we had stuff like, you've had The Witcher that has come out, and
Mhm.
I think it had success, but I think it's also had its issues, right? The problem is like the fandom, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
you you go awry from the fandom, and it ends up having some mixed reviews, or gets
Uh-huh.
review bombed or something like that. And I thought that The Witcher's like, the first season of The Witcher did really, really well. The second season was kind of trying to figure out what it wanted to do with itself.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, have you read any of the books by the author Alexander Spiorsky, or I can't quite
Yeah.
remember how to say it.
I had played, my journey with The Witcher began with The Witcher 1 on PC.
Me
And I
too.
and I
I loved
yeah,
it.
yeah, I picked it up randomly on, like, when Microsoft Live did video games. Like,
Yep.
they had a
Yep.
they had a
Me
different
too.
storefront. Yeah, I bought it on there randomly, and I was like, "Wow, this game is incredible, and the storytelling is really cool." And here are these collectible sex cards, and I'm like, "This is what is going on? What is this game about?" So I start
Yeah.
doing my research and discover, like, it's this Polish, like, dark fantasy novel that was written way back when. So I end up finding a copy of The Hexer, the television show, and I
Yeah.
watched it back to back in Polish, with the auto translating English subtitles on YouTube. And I was like stuck in. I was like, this is so cool. And then Witcher 2 hits, which is like, I think it's still in my top 5 role playing games of
Such
all
a good game.
time.
Such a
Yeah, it
great
really
game.
is. I love Witcher 3, but Witcher 2 I think has a stronger story.
Yeah.
And the setup's better. I just think it's the story. I think the story is better, but regardless, yeah, The Witcher The Witcher television show, has been, a big influence on my writing. I love dark
Yeah.
fantasy. I love horror dark fantasy more
Yeah.
specifically, and that kind of ticks off on that box for the type of media that I enjoy.
Yeah. Awesome. Very good. Very good. Yeah, and I want to touch on that when we kind of get into
Yeah.
Zweihander and all that stuff too, because I definitely feel like my role playing um knit like where I like to play and kind of in the sandbox is that area as well, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I'll play sci-fi, I'll play all the other things, but where I really love is that dark, like um, that dark low fantasy type thing.
Mhm.
That's a lot of fun. So, um, as far as our geek news, what I wanted to talk about this week, we don't have a ton, but Wizards of the Coast announced this last week that they are putting out the OGL 2.0 after the disaster that was 1.1. And they announced that it was coming out on the Creative Commons, or they're going to base it off of a Creative Commons framework, which
Mhm.
I think is probably the way that they should have gone anyway, just because the Creative Commons is a known entity to
Yep.
a lot of people, especially in the creative industries, like art, music, videos, like all that type of stuff. And one of the things that they mentioned is that they were basically handing the OGL over to a third party who would be the curator of it, and that Wizards of the Coast wasn't going to be the ones that would tinker with, and that this would be irrevocable. It would not, that they couldn't
Mm.
yank it away like maybe a 1.0 or 1.05, right? So
Yeah.
um, I'm kind of curious, like we had a lot of comments on our last video about the OGL, and you as a developer, I'm kind of curious to know what you were thinking as you saw all of this like sort of unravel over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah. So, uh, like other designers, I saw the original the revised OGL, the early OGL they released like over a month ago,
Okay.
and I couldn't talk about it publicly. I think I was actually when it first started getting when it was first break the story was breaking. I think it was an Indestructible Boys YouTube chat,
Hmm.
and because it was about to finally drop because Linda Cadega they were about to release the story, and it, I'm not surprised, I guess I should say, because the way that Wizards of the Coast is kind of heading, because of their leadership consists of ex video game executives. It's not
Yeah.
surprising to see them want to try to claw back some of what they feel they quote lost. But I think I think people have spoken about this plenty. People who are much more educated on it than I am. But I will say that what I think that Wizards of the Coast executives, meaning the people from Hasbro, underestimated is that D&D is folk tradition. It's
Right.
not a brand, and that D&D is empowered by the culture around it, not about the ampersand, not about the toys and apparel. It's really about the community, and I think that's the thing that they missed, like a big miss on that. I
Yeah.
have a very strong feeling that people in decision-making positions inside Wizards of the Coast were not in favor of the OGL, but Hasbro and the people they kind of pass down their orders through are going to do what they're going to do. So right, wrong, or indifferent, it's good that they're going to entertain changing it. I'm a little I'm not I guess I'm kind of worried in the sense that they could potentially send cease and desist to people who would fold in front of like legal threat. But
Hmm.
my opinion, my professional opinion, I'm not an attorney, just on this, but it's you can't copyright anything in the OGL. In fact, that the OGL is a paper tiger. I think
Right.
we've kind of included it in work because of the fear of reprisal. But nonetheless, like these game mechanics, like the D20, or the term armor class, or the word strength, like these things have been available in other RPGs beyond D&D. That persisted well before Wizards of the Coast ever owned D&D. So
Right.
I have a little bit of experience with this, and it actually goes all the way back to 2016. And this is we'll probably talk more about Zweihander, I'm sure, at some point, but Zweihander was intended to be a retro clone of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
yeah, in my challenge was there's no OGL for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but I love the mechanics. So
Yeah.
how can I replicate parts of that game engine to give a similar feel, but strip away all of the IP, strip away the things that I didn't like about the old world in Warhammer? How do I just strip it down to its nuts and bolts of the game mechanics itself, and then start to kind of change the mechanics to fit what I wanted to do? And I went back and forth with my attorney on this, because I was very concerned that I could potentially provoke Games Workshop to fire from orbit at me and sue me to death. But the
And
reality is,
they do.
yeah,
Their Battlefleet Gothic is
yeah,
waiting
yeah.
to fire to nuke from orbit. They really
That's
are.
right. That's right. But the net of that those conversations was, um, you can copyright the particular expression of mechanics, but you can't copyright the mechanics themselves.
Mhm, mhm.
Furthermore, there was no trademark on it. So when I developed Zweihander, I developed it with zero concerns that it would be that I undergo any sort of legal scrutiny from Games Workshop, and that has held up for 7 years.
Yeah.
Even though the connectivity between Zweihander and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is thin at this point at best, nonetheless, that is its origin. So I very much understand where the higher level philosophical concerns are around companies examining their business and how it relates to the OGL, because there are several third
Yeah.
party publishers, including Paizo, before the big announcement, that were, that are potentially looking at losing their business because of these
Right.
changes. It's good the community spoke up. That's all that's kind of my final point on it. It's great that we spoke up, we unified, we locked arms despite our differences, and we managed to force major change, which is saying something. I don't think there's ever been an existential crisis in the RPG world as there has been with the OGL.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me to see how at first I was reading this and I'm like, I don't understand. Like I legitimately didn't understand what all of the fuss was about, right? And then I actually read the OGL and I'm like,
Yeah,
oh, there was like three parts, and we talked about it on our last episode, and we don't need to rehash it here. But there's certain parts that were like, oh, okay, now this makes more sense. Why people are getting as upset as they are about this, and
yeah.
yeah, it's funny. It's funny because literally last week we submitted we have a Patreon account, and
Hmm.
one of our Patreon rewards is we are putting out an RPG adventure based on, it could be D&D, it could be Mothership, it could be just a
Hmm.
lot of a lot of these, Call of Cthulhu, something like that, that we're playing a lot of different things on. And one of them might be a Zweihander adventure that we
Hmm.
want to try to put out, and so um anyway, the point is that we submitted our D&D adventure through Drive Through RPG, and the guys who run it are great, and he came back and says, okay, you're using the OGL, here's all the things that you need to fix with your thing.
Yeah,
And I'm like, oh my gosh, like
yeah.
it was a laundry list of things, and I thought we were being careful. And we had to go through and change all this stuff, and then we had to go through and like line item every instance that we had used, like the references. And most often the references that we used were in the pre-gens that we made, right? Because we used
Yeah.
certain spells and things like that. And so we said, you know what? Let's pull out the pre-gens. And
Uh-huh.
if we do that, then we don't have anything from the system reference document. We're probably still publishing under the OGL because it's the OGL, but we don't have to line item every single thing that we did, because it would have been onerous to have to go through and like list out every single thing.
Yeah,
So
I mean, to talk about, creators, I think, set aside the fact that's impacting companies. Let's talk about creators like you, like
yeah,
other creators who are just like using Patreon to monetize content, sharing their adventures out there, trying to find a platform to even give them out for free. And because Drive Through RPG is Drive Through RPG is, the number one digital resource for games, for RPGs, at least next to itch, but set aside itch for a moment.
yeah,
They're bound by contract, with the DMs Guild. They have to arbitrate that content because they're on the hook.
yeah,
So the impact it's felt among creators small and large is very, very real. And I will say, I'm it's there's some silver lining here. The silver lining is that uh people who may have started their journey with D&D 5th edition are now looking at other games. Anecdotally, a local store here in the Kansas City area called Tabletop Game and Hobby,
Mhm.
owned by Phil Kilgore. It's a Gamma Power Seller top 10 store in the United States. So it's moving a lot of product. And Phil and I have been talking, and he said, we can't keep Pathfinder on the shelves. We can't keep any game on the shelves. D&D is sitting there, and everything else is gone. So I walked in to the game store on
Wow.
Saturday. They had their second largest weekend since the launch of D&D 5th edition last weekend. Um,
Wow.
because so many games are selling, and this word of mouth thing. It's not just on social media. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
sure you've seen there's articles on, there's articles everywhere about this at this point. Washington Post had an article on it, but this is like
Yeah, that
had
blew
these
my mind.
yeah, it had these massive ripples to people who probably don't even know what the hell the OGL is,
Yeah.
but there's such negative sentiment toward D&D. It has been beneficial for people who make games that are not D&D, and that's the exciting part. I can tell
Yeah.
you, from my own experience that Zweihander sales have been absolutely wild.
Awesome. Awesome.
That first week the OGL was announced, I was like, oh man, a lot of people are hurting from this. I'm going to give away some Zweihander free Zweihander Roll20 codes just to like help some people take their minds off of things.
Yeah.
Just to kind of, just to like say, this thing is like big and pervasive. Here, try this other game just for now. Hopefully
Yeah.
it'll bring you some joy. Within a week, I had sold like over 600 starter kits. Like
Whoa.
box starter kits. Like it was absolutely wild and unexpected. And that was not the intention. But
Yeah.
from my experience, like it's been good. Paizo, I mean, you can't find a Pathfinder book anywhere hardly in the United States on the bookshelf in a favorite local gaming store.
Mhm.
It's really hard to find right now. That's great for Paizo and Pathfinder. It's really good for third-party RPG publishers because their games, are getting their day in the sun with these people who don't know any games beyond D&D 5th edition, and
Yeah.
that's incredible. That's the silver lining here. And whatever D&D nets out with the OGL, I think the industry has shifted now in a way that Wizards of the Coast through Hasbro have to do a lot of community building to earn back the trust of the community.
Yeah,
It's
they've
important.
lost a little bit of the moral high ground, and it's funny because this interview was obviously not planned around the OGL, right? Like I had reached out to you back in December to see if we
Yeah,
could get something on the books, which it just happened to be this week was the week that we could do it,
yeah,
and one of the questions that we asked is like, how's this going to affect the community? And I said personally, like I'm just talking about me. I played D&D 5th edition. We played Rime of the Frost Maiden. We ran that campaign, and it was a ton of fun. It was probably one of Wizards of the Coast's best campaigns in my opinion because it was just very well written.
hmm
However, and I don't know if you can see maybe right here on
yeah.
my screen,
One Ring,
that's
I see that. Yeah,
yeah, there you go. You got
Blackbird.
the One Ring starter set. You've got the Witcher. You've got the Call of Cthulhu starter set. Warhammer Fantasy starter set. I'm a sucker for starter sets, including the Zweihander starter set, which we'll talk about in a
Hmm.
little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm a big sucker for starter sets because it's so great to easily just pull it out, test out the system with your buddies. I mean,
Hmm.
the starter sets range anywhere from like the ridiculously cheap $20 Call of Cthulhu set to the little bit more expensive RuneQuest $50 starter set, and everything in between kind of thing. And
Yeah.
but you can for the price of you know 20, 30, $40, you can have a great session or two or three out of one of these starter sets and really get into a new system with your gaming group.
Yeah, one of my New Year's resolutions. I don't typically make resolutions, but this year I was like, when I buy RPGs, I'm going to start first with the starter set,
Yep.
as opposed to going whole hog into the book. Because what I find is that I buy the book, I flip through it, it goes on my shelf. But
Yeah.
if I buy a starter kit, I open it, I explore it, I look at what's inside, I look at the pre-gens, I look at all the options because I love one thing I really love about starter kits in particular is I love the fact that it's kind of hybrid board game, hybrid RPG
Yep.
experience. You have
Yep.
because I love the unboxing experience of board games. I love popping the chits out of the MDF board. I love tearing the cards and looking through the stuff. That's what I love about starter kits. Starter kits you can
Yeah,
really kind of sink your teeth into all the physical components. Like that's a big
very
part of.
tangible.
Yeah, yeah, it's a big reason why I absolutely was, my favorite era of D&D is the AD&D era because we had so many different box kits
Yeah.
that had like acetate overlays and big fold out maps and things like that. And a lot of that experience when I was younger went into building the Zweihander starter kit. But I love the starter kit. I love starter kits in general. I just picked up the Dune one, which is I think in the
Oh,
higher
nice.
it's a $79 one, but it
Yep.
comes with an absolute ton of material. Between that and the Pathfinder beginner box, I mean, those in my mind, even though they're a little bit more expensive, they are some of the best starter kits
Hmm.
ever created
Yeah.
in the modern age, in the sense that modern D&D, modern OGL, modern RPGs.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved, we did a review on the Call of Cthulhu starter kit. One of the things that I absolutely love about that starter kit is it comes with a solo adventure
Yeah.
that you play, and it teaches the
Yes.
DM how to play the game, right? And so as the DM, you play the solo adventure and you're having a ton of fun doing it, right? Because it's like one of those choose your own adventure games.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you're like, oh, this is how you roll for a combat. Oh, this is how you roll for a skill check. Oh, and, this is how you compare and contrast. This is what this stat is for. This is what this category is for. And so having that in there to teach the DM and give the DM an experience of what it's like to play the game without having to learn it on the fly 100% with his new
Yeah.
players was so great. And RuneQuest had the same thing. And
Hmm.
I don't think I could have run the RuneQuest starter adventure with my friends without having played that starter adventure, solo adventure, because it was just very informative and instructive. And you get a good feel of the world that they're trying to create by playing those solo adventures, right? Like you get the flavor, you get the lore, you get kind of like the ambiance, like all of that with those solo adventures. That was good. Um,
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of I've went this is my I've done a second playthrough of Thousand Year Old Vampire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a
hmm,
solo journaling game about being a vampire. And it has a little journal you get, and then you play through the game like that. That's what I liked about the Call of Cthulhu starter kit too, is that you get to learn the
yeah,
mechanics as you build your character in the story. It's a
yeah.
very clever way to do like solo RPGing and in journal RPGing, like a really interesting hybrid approach. It's one thing I wished we would have done on this Zweihander starter kit because it's such a clever way to introduce new players, new storytellers to a system.
Well, you can always come up with a solo adventure and put it out for free, right? And just let people
Yeah,
like get up in that, right?
yeah,
So that's an awesome way to do it. But I was gonna say the one thing that I absolutely love about solo or starter kits is that I feel like starter kits are what the developer really wants you to experience as a first time player,
yeah.
right? Like the developer gets to set that tone. They get to choose the adventure that you're going to play. They gotta get to kind of make those pre-gens. They get to make the map. They get to make the adventure
Mhm.
and say like, this is kind of our baby that we're launching out to you, so rather than just picking up a, even just picking up an adventure off of our drive through RPG or something, or going through the core book and homebrewing something yourself, you really get to experience what the developer had in mind for that system, and I think that's awesome about it.
Yeah. Yeah, the distillation of the most essential things about a game, whether it be theme or genre or mechanics, like that experience is what you have to forcibly fit
Hmm.
inside a box. And it's a
Yeah.
really interesting creative exercise. It's a very intriguing creative exercise because I think, I think about my experience playing Call of Cthulhu way back in the day, and
Yeah.
then playing and then going through the starter kit and realizing like the intentionality that the
Hmm.
creators had versus the way that we were playing it. And it's very fascinating because you get a real good sense of what the experience they want you to have. So in a perfect world, every RPG starts with a starter kit. But
Hmm.
that's prohibitively expensive, unfortunately. So
It's really hard to
oftentimes
do.
it is. Oftentimes you'll find a book will come, then a starter kit, and that's just the nature of the print production cycle. But
Yeah.
more importantly, I think to your point, like, the starter kit, a starter kit for any RPG really is about what experience you want players to have with your game to intrigue them enough to invest in the core rulebook, to invest in whatever additional supplements there are. And once again, it's a very challenging and exciting creative exercise that I've undergone, and I know a lot of other publishers have undergone too. But it comes out the end, you end up with this really nice experience that you can sell inexpensively and hopefully sell lots of units, because more units lead to more books, lead to more sales, leads to more money for people to actually produce and make games.
That's right. Absolutely right. Okay, well, all of that aside, we definitely want to talk about what's in your starter kit that
Hmm.
you came out, but let's get a little bit of background here. So
Yeah.
you've told us a little about you and gaming, right? You started out playing D&D way back in the day, it sounded like.
Yeah.
What got you into wanting to become like a developer, and more specifically, like not a D&D developer?
Yeah. So I started playing D&D when I was 11. I think my first edition was AD&D second edition.
Hmm.
I was given a monster manual. Like I was a skateboarder and a breakdancer when I was a kid, because 80s. And it was like wintertime, and my buddy's brother, stoner brother, gave me a copy of the monster manual. That my mom bought the player's handbook and so on and so forth. And we ended up playing D&D for years and years and years and years and years.
Yeah,
And then fourth edition D&D comes out, and I hate it.
yeah,
and
yeah.
and I started looking elsewhere. And my favorite local gaming store, Tabletop, the owner, Phil Kilgore, he's like, "Have you seen Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay?" And
Mm,
I'm like, "No, but let me read a little about it." So I bought the book and I sat on top of it for a year, and then eventually I discover like this like skill-based system that I just absolutely fall in love with. And I love the fact that it's profession based. So it's not based off of classes, it's based off of like normal
right.
everyday people getting thrust into like really challenging weird situations. And I just fell in love. I fell in love with the game mechanics, but I did not like the old world setting because it was so
Mm,
dramatically different than my game world. Because my intention was never actually to make a commercial product.
yeah.
It was to homebrew a system for my friends in our basement to play that was different than D&D and could emulate the things that we really loved about gaming, which was a more realistic, gritty approach, which D&D we fiddled with for many, many different editions and years and just could never get it dialed in right. We
Hmm.
wanted the opportunity to play normal, everyday people, not the fighter, mage, wizard, thief. We wanted to play like peasants and laborers and stevedores and road agents and things like that. And we also wanted the ability to kind of allow people to do more than just swing swords. So the skill-based system that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay had built in, which was loosely based off a game before that called Maelstrom. Like
Yep.
those two games were like these quintessential games that I just fell in love with. So I end up making this kind of hodgepodge game at my table, merging my kind of low fantasy campaign world, dark fantasy campaign world into the Warhammer system. And then suddenly I discovered this super vibrant community of Warhammer fantasy roleplay players at this website called Strike to Stun. And then I started sharing out what we were doing at my game table, and people are like, "Oh my god, like you should turn this into a game." And my game group's like, "You should turn this into a game." And I'm like, "Well, we'll see. Like I've never written anything in my entire life save for a few term papers and contracts
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
my day job. So eventually I released kind of like a loose version of what is called Project Core Hammer, and that was intended to give just the bare bones elements, the engine itself, to run Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay World using the game engine. And this is about the time that WFRP third edition came out, which was kind of
Okay.
at the time it was universally reviled. I think that
Yeah.
was a misstep. I think it's a brilliant game. I love it. But it was not well liked by the Warhammer community because it was a
Mm,
board game hybrid experience. It was just
yeah.
wrong game, wrong time. If it came out
Yeah.
today, I think it'd be a massive hit. But
Interesting.
nonetheless, I release it, and then people start glomming onto it. So I'm like, well, maybe I'll bring it to Kickstarter. And this is like in 2015, mind you. So this is like in the early days of Kickstarter when tabletop
Mhm.
RPGs on Kickstarter were like few and far between. So I sit down with my buddy Tim, and he's like a VP at Bank of America, and I'm like, man, I just want to like see if I can print some books at Lulu.com. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I'm gonna see if I can sell 100 books on Kickstarter. I don't know. Well, let's find out. So I ended up setting up a Kickstarter. I named the game Zweihander because I know I wanted the book to be big and held in two hands, like this Zweihander sword. Like,
That's amazing.
right?
That's how you
Yeah.
came up with the name?
Yeah, I
That's
want it to
so
be like
awesome.
a big book you can hold on to with both hands. And that's when the name originated. And I brought it to Kickstarter. And I think my initial goal was like $900. It raises like $62,000. And I'm like, holy crap, like people like this. And then I realized shortly thereafter, I raised another 128,000 on BackerKit and CrowdOx. And suddenly I have $250,000 sitting in the bank account. And I'm just flabbergasted. I'm like, well, why this game? Why is this like the one that's kind of standing out? And I attribute it to there's a gap in the industry at the time, like
Mhm.
people weren't satisfied with Warhammer,
Yeah.
but also I came from the digital advertising world. I spent 17 years of my career in advertising, so I knew how to
Mhm.
utilize paid ads on Facebook. I knew how to use SEO on Google. I was calling game stores and selling direct to them. I was doing everything I
Mhm.
could to build awareness around it. So trade marketing and consumer marketing. And then in 2018, I submit it to the Ennies at Gen Con on a whim, and it ends up winning best game and product of the year. And I guess now I'm a game publisher.
You're
So
legit now. So
yeah.
I was at Gen Con 2018.
Oh, were you?
Yep,
Yeah.
and I remember hearing about Zweihander when I was there.
Yeah.
And, I went by the booth that because you guys had a booth, I think, right?
Unfortunately we didn't. The funny thing is we went to Gen
Were
Con
you
and we
selling
had
it somewhere?
We had 0 books to sell at Gen Con. We had nothing.
That's what
We
I
had
was
no
saying, like, "Where
yeah,
do I find this book?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, you can't find it," and, like
yeah.
but I was like, "Oh, man," like
We
because I remember being there.
yeah, so we yeah, the crazy thing is that we go to Gen Con, we win best game product of the year, and people are like, "Where can I buy your book?" And I'm like, "You know what? We actually just sold out of every single book because we were hand shipping it out of my house." We
Yeah,
had sold at the time, right before the Ennies, around I think it was around 12,000 books at that point. Like it was pretty significant.
yeah.
I mean, we had numbers that were in comparison to Seventh Sea, like a well-known RPG,
Yeah.
by John Wick.
Yep.
And he's in his third printing, and I was talking with him on Facebook about it. I was like, yeah, we just sold 12,000 books in the past like year and a half. And he's like, that's incredible. So the Ennies happen. We have no books in stock. Like I go through another print run with a local printer here. I work with actually my print shop that I worked at initially was Larry Elmore's print shop here in Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh, wow, okay.
And they do like print books for Jostin's yearbooks. I don't know if you remember like photos in school
Yeah,
and stuff like Jostin's
yeah.
is yeah.
My kids still
Yeah.
get Jostens yearbooks,
Yeah.
right? So,
So
yeah.
the Ennies happen, and we go to Gen Con, and I printed a bunch of business cards, and I give away 15,000 or not 15,000, 25,000 cards I printed off
Oh
business
my
cards as
god.
free PDFs. We hand them all out, but I think we only because we tracked it, we got like around 7,500 downloads or something like that, and I gave them
Still
away for
pretty
free.
significant.
Yeah, yeah. We gave them to everybody, anyone we possibly could. I did a lot of paid ads to like
Yeah.
promote it, put it on Reddit, and it ended up everywhere. So suddenly, Zweihander became like this kind of weird breakout third party, solo success, and that at that point, sales just kind of skyrocketed. I
Can I
ended
ask
up
you something
doing
real quick?
yeah, by all means,
So you were planning like what, like 100 copies, selling
100
100
copies.
copies or something like that?
Yeah,
And all of a sudden, like it ballooned. Did you freak out in that moment? Like, because we talked about this on Kickstarter, like
yeah,
sometimes the windfall is not a blessing, right?
no,
Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's difficult. So I'm
yeah.
curious to hear it from someone who experienced it. Like, what was that like when you went through it?
Yeah, the devil's in the details, right? I remember seeing the numbers climb and climb and climb, and then my stress level started to climb because my anxiety, I started getting very anxious. I'm like, oh my God, like I can't just do print on demand for these books. Like this is a legit print run. Like, this is like a
Yeah.
legit book I could go out and print. I can't do lulu.com. That would be doing a disservice to these people. And suddenly I was like, oh my God, I didn't charge anything for shipping. Like, am I going to eat all this money in shipping? And then 30th day comes, my wife, like, she makes me like a cookie cake and puts the number. I still have it on my Facebook, I'm sure, but this cookie cake she made me with like the amount of money I raised, and I was just floored. And it's like, now I got this responsibility to like deliver these books. So um I literally look in the yellow pages, like in
Yeah.
Kansas City, for a printer, and I find that print shop that Larry Elmore worked with,
Yeah.
and I find a fulfillment company based out of Kansas. Unfortunately, that fulfillment company didn't work out too hot, but um, somehow a year later we get all the books out, and it was, we were in the black, like we were in the red.
That's good.
I think my net, after all that $250,000 in raise, my net was like less than $600 in my
Wow.
pocket.
Seriously.
That's after paying my artist, my layout,
Yeah.
my print, as I ate the shipping cost. Um, I ended up walking away with hardly anything, but I could say that I made this game, and it was, and now people were playing the game that I was playing at my game table with my buddies for the
Yeah.
last 4 years, and that was really cool. And that's as far as I thought it was. That's about as far as I thought it would go. And then it goes the Ennies, it wins that, and then I get picked up by a publisher in Kansas City, called Andrews McMeel. They want to
Hmm.
publish my books, and then they say, hey, let's actually form an RPG publishing department in our company. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Because Andrews McNeil, like, what did they publish that? Um, man, there was something that they published that I'm like, I've heard that name before,
yeah, so they're
for a
the
book
most,
that they put.
yeah, and the most they're probably their most well-known author is Rupi Kaur. She was a Instagram poet, but they're actually fairly well known for their syndication arm, because they syndicate Doonesbury, Boondocks, Garfield, Sally, Peanuts.
Yeah,
Like, they
Calvin
own
and Hobbes.
Calvin and Hobbes.
That
Yeah,
was
they
like their
own,
big one. Yeah.
yeah, the syndicated arm. Foxtrot, like the author is
Hmm.
Foxtrot. When I was working there, he was like literally four doors down from me in the office. Um, Bill Amon. So it was really weird going in there as a published author, or growing up in Kansas City and knowing who they are, a
Yeah.
52-year-old publisher who I can, find the work that they do in the Sunday Funny papers, to being a published
Right.
author with them, then going to work for them over the last 4 years. And
Yeah.
Zweihander just continued to grow and grow and grow once I joined the company.
That's awesome. What was it? It must have felt like a big step, being like, okay, I'm solidifying a deal with an actual publishing company.
Mhm.
Because if you look at some of the other third party groups, so back in 20, was it 2016 or 2017? 2017, I think. I was at Gen Con, and on a whim, my friend and I decided, Jason, who's a co-host of this, decided to
Mhm.
try an RPG called Shadow of the Demon Lord
Yeah.
by Robert J. Schwab, right? And we played that game and instantly fell in love with it for all the same reasons that you developed Zweihander, right? It was low fantasy, dark and gritty.
Mhm.
Choices had real consequences.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you could die, and you probably will die. There's a whole horror sanity mechanic that was a utter blast to play with it.
Mhm.
And again, the idea of like normal people being thrust into these horrific situations, right? And
Yeah.
so I ended up running a big campaign from that. But Rob Schwab, I don't think that he works with like any one particular publishing company, right? I think he finds printers and he fulfills it and publishes it himself and all of that stuff. So you going the actual like publisher route, I think is kind of rare in the industry. You could feel free to correct me, but I can't think of third party publishers that are really like working with a publishing company like Andrews McNeil.
Yeah. It's definitely, I think I'm a unique case. There's a number of reasons for it. Luck, privilege, opportunity.
Yeah.
But the reality is I was from outside the game industry. I had a tangential interest in convention going. Most of my gaming was done in the shadows of my basement after school or after work, and it was just us gaming together. We didn't really go to
Yeah.
game stores. I'd never been to a convention until 2018. I've
Oh,
been to
wow.
small conventions like locally, but never like Gen Con or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I was not I was not interwoven into the larger geek circles. Just me and my buddies, like, we were playing D&D. My girlfriends from high school and after high school, my guy friends. So we just play games together. That was it. And then I kind of came outside the industry, and I came from, the business world. I spent my professional experience working in business development. So a lot of those things I learned there, I managed to apply to what I was doing in
Hmm.
publishing. And that's what got me into Anders McMeel. And I think that Anders McMeel, next to Osprey, is probably one of the only trad publishers that actually ever picked up games. And
Yeah.
Anders McMeel continues to publish games, even though I'm no longer working there. But it is unique in the sense that, Anders McMeel distributes through Simon and Schuster. Same reach in distribution that Wizards of the Coast has through
Yep.
Penguin. So
Yep.
definitely unique. Speaking of Rob Schwab, I know he worked on some Warhammer Fantasy roleplay stuff early on when second edition with
Yep.
Chris Promise from Green Ronin. I think
Hmm.
he also may have worked on some D&D third edition stuff too, if I'm not mistaken.
He
I love
did
Shadow of
fifth
the Demon Lord.
edition.
Yeah, that's right.
So
I
he's,
love
yeah.
I love Shadow of the Demon Lord though. It's a really cool
Yeah.
game. It's a really
It
cool game.
is. If so, it's funny because I ran some role playing games with my colleagues at work. They find out that I'm a dungeon master, and they're like, "We've never played
Ah,
before," and I'm like, "Well, let's get the funny sided dice out and let's take you for a
beautiful.
ride, right?"
Love it.
And what I ended up teaching them was not D&D. I taught them Shadow of the Demon Lord because it's such an easier system to pick up and play,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because you're rolling either your 20-sided dice and your boons, or banes, which are d6s, and that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm.
And you maybe once in a while you roll another one, but in terms of explaining how things work, it's super easy. What I did have to do though is tone it down to PG-13 level because Shadow
Yeah.
of the Demon Lord and Rob Schwab likes to crank that up to the TVMA.
Yeah, it's a mature game. When I think about like dark fantasy games, like if I want to run a dark fantasy game that's like D&D, I run Shadow of the Demon Lord.
Yeah.
What I wanted to create was Zweihander though, was give give me Call of Cthulhu, but in the world of Les Miserables.
Yes.
Give me Call of Cthulhu in the Renaissance, but without like weird, extra dimensional monsters. But give me all the normal people put in extraordinary situations, and not about like the zero to hero effect, which you have in Shadow of the Demon Lord in D&D. It's in Zweihander, it's 0 to 1.
Yeah.
It's not about people who change the world. It's about a world that changes the people, that changes the adventurers.
Yeah.
And then they have to contend with the psychological aftermath of the choices that they made. Will they become, they become like the monsters they're fighting? Will they devolve to their baser selves? And to me, that's always been the compelling element about dark fantasy, that I really liked about Call of Cthulhu. The things I was
Yep.
kind of present in Warhammer, but
Yeah.
definitely present in Maelstrom, and definitely the thing that I carried forward into Zweihander when I began development on that.
So it's interesting you mentioned that because we had Mike Mason on the show,
Mhm.
who is head of
Yeah,
Chaosium right now, right? And he was instrumental in writing a lot of Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. But before that, he worked on Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer Rogue Trader
yeah,
and all of these kind of like he was one of the original guys that was writing the Warhammer 40,000 role playing game.
yeah.
And so a lot of that obviously bled into Warhammer Fantasy,
Mhm.
and it's interesting to see his fingerprints on a lot of these types of things because one of the
Uh-huh.
things that he specifically said in our interview with him is he says, "I love the scenarios where you take ordinary people having to do extraordinary things."
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it's so awesome that you pulled that from Warhammer Fantasy. And even though Warhammer Fantasy's got its own setting, and
Mhm.
you may not like the Reichland and all that stuff, right? But you pulled that thematic feeling of like 0 to 1, right? Like ordinary person's got to step up because who else is going to do it?
Yeah.
And then dealing with the aftermath, I think, is the most interesting part of it, because that's to me where the story comes in, right? Like there's a reason why there's not D&D content for players 15 to 20 that's
Hmm.
out there, that you have to homebrew that stuff, because A, the game kind of mechanics break down at that level. That's the first
Hmm.
thing. And
Yeah.
B, it's like you become so incredibly powerful that, like, what is there left to do?
Yeah.
And that's, to me, boring. Like, that's
Hmm.
boring. Like, I want to know about the person that struggles. I want to know about the person that loses their mind accomplishing this greatest task and nobody's ever going to know about
Yeah.
it. You know?
Yeah. You were talking about the road earlier and Cormac McCarthy. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a the I have always been drawn to um fiction in that sense, not like nerd fiction, but just like novels and books and film, that is about the everyman, going through something horrible and tragic and watching the story of that tragedy unfold.
Hmm.
Um, I'm thinking about the most recent film, with Brendan Fraser, The Whale, which is based off a play, and it's a really intriguing story about a man who's like he's a not a he was not he didn't live a great life, and seeing the story of this all kind of come to be, like, it's there's a form of catharsis to be found,
Yeah.
I think, in witnessing tragedy on film, and I think that for me as a game designer, like, I love seeing those stories play out at the game table. I love pitting my players in situations where it's not about making the right or wrong choice. It's not about making the good
Hmm.
choice, the bad choice, or an evil choice, or a goodly choice. It's about making a choice, and those
Right.
choices sometimes have small ripples, and sometimes they have ripples that that you find later on. But nonetheless, like, choices in the moment that are self-serving, oftentimes are the ones that come back to bite you. And I love position pitting players into those situations to see their personal stories unfold at the game table. So Zweihander, when I thought about like what I wanted that game to emulate, was to emulate that experience from my game table to players, to have
Yeah.
that catharsis, to experience that tragedy and see how that tragedy plays out, not only just narratively in the story, but also mechanically on the game sheet. I can tell you, my biggest quibble with some of the earlier D&D versions was like, make your saving throw versus fear. What happens when you fail a
Hmm.
saving throw versus fear? You run for X number of rounds, you turn right back around and head back to fight the dragon, right? To me,
Right.
that's
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
it seems so arbitrary.
Right. Oh, I'm
So
over that now.
yeah, so when I thought about that in Zweihander, I was like, I need to make like these narrative choices and outcomes have mechanical weight that actually makes sense. And
Hmm.
and that's where a lot of the disorders and drawback system was drawn with corruption.
Hmm.
It's why that I view that these aren't punishments, but they're actually character embellishments.
Yes.
It's like, and this is, to kind of take this up a level, like anybody who's experienced tragedy, who has experienced, like, who has, has undergone like something terrible, you develop survival strategies to like
Hmm.
survive the situations. Like people who are agoraphobic, who have to go out in public, they surround themselves with friends, so they're around people they know. That's a survival strategy.
Yeah.
A big part of Zweihander, when you accumulate these disorders or drawbacks, is that you develop survival strategies around it, and so they are additive to the character, they're not punitive.
Right.
And I think that is a more compelling story to tell than, well, guess what? Your character's dead. Roll a new one, because death is so disinteresting in a game.
Right. Right.
It can bring a story, it can bring a campaign to a complete halt. What's more interesting is like seeing the psychological scars that the character bears with them. Like that's a more compelling thing to experience at the game table. And one of the things I absolutely loved about early Rogue Trader, Call of Cthulhu,
Hmm.
um, it's really interesting you mentioned Mike Mason, because my favorite Warhammer 40K role playing game books were the times that he was writing it, back when it was
Yeah.
still like very pressed tongue firmly in cheek, when it was still like
Yes.
very jokey and political, and like, you're not supposed to like these guys, like these are actually terrible people, but it's grimly funny.
Yeah.
That's I think the heyday of that game line when he was working on it. But nonetheless, like, to take this full circle, like, I love that experience as a player. I love that experience as a game master, and that's what I want Zweihander to emulate, is that experience of the character's growth through horrific undergoings. And by horrific, I mean something I give you a good example. So in my home game, short story, but this will kind of drive home the point. So there's in the story of my game, this is many, many years ago, the players have been chasing an arsonist. They've been chasing him halfway across the country, across like several game sessions. They finally catch up to him, and he's inside this port town called Old Lork.
Mhm.
And they finally pinpoint him in the dockyards, and it's nighttime, and they're pretty sure that he's on a ship that's docked in the port, and they see a fire break out on the ship, and they see him running off. He's like, oh, he's burning another ship, we better chase after him. But then they realize that there's actually a merchant family trapped on the ship that's burning. So I pit them with the choice, like, you've
Yeah.
been chasing this person in the game world for weeks, in outside the game world for like 9 game sessions. Will you pursue the arsonist, who will probably cause even more havoc if you don't capture him now, or do you go to save the family? Because they couldn't split the party.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work that way. There's not enough people. So
Right.
they had to make the choice. Like, do we save the family, or do we go after the person we've been chasing? They make the choice to go out to save the family. So they gain corruption for that, because it's a choice made in the moment. It's not the right
Yeah.
choice or the wrong choice. It's just a choice. Like, um that's the sort of stuff I like to pit stories around, is like those difficult decisions, because those are the things that really build characterization and help get people in the mindset of the world of the game. And,
Yeah.
and it's far more interesting than hacking at a bag of hit points with a sword,
Yeah.
or
Totally.
pulling, right, or just having your character die, because
Right.
it's boring. Like, but that plays into this kind of theme behind a lot of like these kind of gritty games, which is like the illusion of cruelty. The game appears to be deadly, but it's actually not. Zweihander is not a
Yeah.
deadly game by any means, but I'm sure we'll talk
Interesting.
more about that at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because and I may have mentioned this before when we were playing one of our very first adventures with Shadow of the Demon Lord. I had this evil dryad who was basically corrupting the forest, and was
Hmm.
going into these forest animals were going into towns and like or homesteads and stealing children and taking them into the forest. So they had to go deal with this dryad, right? And Jason, again, he was playing in our campaign.
Hmm.
His backstory was that he had lost his wife or girlfriend or fiance, I couldn't remember, but he had lost her and he wanted enough power to bring her back to life. So that
Mm.
was driving him, right? Like driving him to do this. So they confront this dryad, right? They have this battle, this fight, and she just basically says, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa! What are we doing here, guys? Like, why are we fighting? I'll go away. I'll leave. You just let me go away. I'll leave. And in fact, I'll give you this medallion of power that gives you the power that you need to do whatever you need to with it. And Jason was instantly like, I'm in. I'm
Yeah.
taking it. I'm taking the deal. And she said, I'll swear an oath that I'll leave. And so he knew that she was going to leave, but he grabbed this medallion that gave him so much corruption, right? Because it was like not a great medallion. And even though the
Mhm.
outcome was favorable to the town, like it was maybe the wrong choice or right choice, who knows? It was kind of in the moment. But the other thing, and this is the main point that I wanted to make, is those types of scenarios, what it ends up doing is it ends up creating the right kind of party conflict.
Yes. Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
what happened is one of our players is like, this lady needs to die. This dryad
Mhm.
needs to die, and I'm here to kill her. And Jason's like, you're not going to do that because I'm taking this medallion. And
Yeah.
so they ended up butting heads about it in the right way, right? A lot of people think, oh, party conflict is about like two players arguing over something. Well, that's boring too, right? Like,
Yeah.
or doing like a PvP style battle to, because they got mad at each other. Boring. What's interesting is like they're playing their characters and a choice comes up that puts them at odds with each other, and they have to figure out how to reconcile that because they know they need to work together.
That's right. That's right.
Like, so I love
That's
it. I love that
that
type of
that
stuff.
yeah, that party turmoil thing is helpful, and it's hard to meter, right? Like,
It
I'm
is.
sure you've experienced it at its worst and you experience it at its best. I'm very, very blessed to have two incredible game groups, who our youth, it was very different. When we're young and didn't know much about role-playing games, like
Yeah.
PvP was a thing, like in our
Yeah, yeah,
14,
yeah,
15
yeah.
years old. But now we know that we don't take anything personally. We know that characters are going to have conflict. They're not going to fight each other. But if it ever gets to the point, like the way that I settle it is like if players are going round and round and round, I literally stop the game, and make them do paper rock scissors, best 2 out of 3, and
Yeah.
that whoever chooses it, then what happens is both players narrate as the game master the outcome together,
Nice.
and
Nice.
that's how I settle those kind of conflicts when you have those moments where like the player characters as themselves as the characters are like stating their what the reasoning and why they're doing something and having these feelings and stuff, and that's good and healthy. But at the point where we're like, okay, now we need to actually kind of make a decision.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? We do paper rock scissors. Whoever wins, like they narrate together the outcome together, which they all feel like they're all an active participant in resolving in the moment that turmoil. But it always comes up again later, which is great because inter-party conflict is important because you have these people going through trauma together and
Yes,
they're all going to
100%.
experience it in very different
Different.
ways.
Yes.
Very different
Yes.
ways. Yeah.
I always think about the moment like in video games where it's like this person remembers that.
Yes. Yes.
So they
The
make that
Telltale
choice
game.
and it's like
Yeah.
that character remembers that,
The
and you're like,
the t-
oh,
the
okay.
the Telltale games, Wolf Among
Yes.
Us, Game of Thrones,
Yes.
Walking Dead game. It was fantastic. Like I love that this character will
All of
remember
those.
this. Yeah.
Yes,
I,
exactly. The Wolf
I'm
Among Us was so good. So
It
good.
was. I telegraph that to my players too as a game master. I tell them
Yeah.
when they make a critical choice. I always say, um, you know, remember this moment because it'll come back up later.
Yeah. That's
And
awesome.
they love it because they love to gamify it. Like, oh my god, we have
Yeah.
these like interactions with this one person. I love that sort of stuff. I love being transparent with my players like that too.
So we keep talking and we're skirting an issue that I have to talk about. You
Mhm.
talked about the road, you talked about the whale, you talked about, these telltale games. What is what is the media that you have consumed that, the games, the books,
Mhm.
the movies that like have kind of you've taken all of these things and distilled it into Zweihander. What's your inspiration for this setting?
Yeah, so the biggest inspiration for Zweihander, I mean, was my kind of beyond my own campaign world. It's always been I had this fascination in the PlayStation era with this game called Vagrant Story.
Okay.
It was yeah, it was this it was a SquareSoft game. You blink and you miss it, but it was translated by this gentleman whose name I forget, but he translated Final Fantasy Tactics, and it was
Oh,
written in this like old English archaic tone. It was really, really cool, really interesting story, really dark. And this highly political game that was written this cult classic. I'm sure some of the listeners know exactly the game I'm talking about. But I was really drawn to Vagrant Story. And I remember when I first played, I think I was 19 or 20. It was like I had this like awakening, like around like what tabletop gaming could look like. I was like, what if I took the themes and the story beats from this and tried to replicate it in D&D?
yeah.
And that became such a seminal part of the way I built my own game world. It became the foundation for how I looked at Zweihander, where the magic was rare and seen as heretical in
Mhm.
a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Um, it was very rooted in reality. It was kind of like a Renaissance adjacent world where these soldiers of the cardinal were basically trying to chase down this like cult to take the power for themselves. Like this very, very interesting, like deep intriguing story with terrible gameplay mechanics, but the story was so good, and the framing, the compositions that they would frame in the story itself, it had like these little pop-up balloons like a comic book
Yeah.
with rolling text. It's so brilliant. And that was like the foremost video game, that and Tactics Ogre, and that and Final Fantasy Tactics, that became so influential over my own storytelling, my game table. And when I started to think about what Zweihander could look like, a Zweihander world, it was a world like that. But it
Yeah.
was also a world that could be like Black Company. It was also a world that
Oh
could
my
be
gosh,
like
I
Game
love
of
the Black Company.
yeah. It could be a world set in Joe Abercrombie's world. It could be the Sad
Yep.
Tale of the Brothers Grossbart. It could be The Witcher. It could be the Game of Thrones. And at the end of the day, what I kind of figured out, the big discovery over time was that Zweihander doesn't have a campaign world
Mhm.
at all. it's in the same sense that D&D Fifth Edition has no home campaign world.
Right.
It's a
Right.
tool set. D&D is a tool set to tell high fantasy stories set in these game worlds that D&D has created. Zweihander is a tool set to tell low fantasy stories in game worlds of your own creation, and that's the purpose of Zweihander. It kind of sits somewhere between um, GURPS, which is like a really complicated system,
Yeah.
but could
Yeah.
be flushed into anything. But you know, you either love it or you hate it. Or it's somewhere between that and D&D. But I knew it was going to be a tool set to build and create your own stories and worlds. And although it does have its own separate campaign settings, there is no home world for Zweihander. You could
Cool.
run it in 30 Years War. You could run it in Black Company. You could run it in
Yeah.
a myriad of dark fantasy properties. I've seen people run Darkest Dungeon with it. Um,
Awesome.
I just saw a hack the other day for somebody's trying to run it in Kingdom Death, and I was thinking the other day, like, how amazing would it be to set it in like biblical Old Testament,
Right.
Middle East?
There's
Like,
a
how about
Bible RPG coming out.
yeah, I saw that, and I'm terribly fascinated with it because I love reading.
Terribly fascinated is the right word.
I'm not a religious person, but I
Yeah.
love the Old Testament. It's the most fascinating piece of mythology because
Yeah.
it's like munged with all these different like proto myths from other cultures, and I'm really interested to see like if this Bible RPG like actually ends up being like super dark because it is set, from what I understand, it's set in the Old Testament if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I mean, we talked
Yeah.
about so do you take the Cain archetype or the Abel archetype? Like, so
Sticks to snakes, literally, like in the people turning to pillars of salt. Like, yeah, there's it's the Old Testament is pretty dark. But yeah, but Zweihander, you know, there is no, once again, there's no campaign world. There's themes. In the same sense that D&D has themes. D&D's themes are you are a hero and you'll become a big damn hero.
yeah.
And you'll do it in these crazy worlds of floating elves and crystal spheres and spell jamming ships and planar doors that you will pass through in and out of the multiverse. Zweihander is about broken fairy tales, grim, perilous realities.
Yep.
The occult is real, but people are highly superstitious. Zombies don't walk in the streets, but the stories about monsters, much like how they are in Japanese and early European mythology, especially Polish mythology, it's always about broken people who've done terrible things and they were
Yeah.
changed into something else. It's the foundations that made Ravenloft awesome, the
Right.
early
Right.
Ravenloft stuff. So
Yep.
that's what Zweihander is. Zweihander allows you to emulate all of that with beneath that kind of umbrella of I hate to call it dark fantasy. I like calling it fantasy horror because it is about the horror element is foremost in it. It's less about dark and gritty fantasy, which can sometimes unfortunately border on like some misogynistic views. But
Mhm.
for the purposes of fantasy and horror, like it's a more inclusive genre because horror is so well received by, you know, all manner of spectrum of gender and sexes.
Mhm.
So Zweihander is fantasy horror at the forefront, and the horror that isn't necessarily just about like ghosts are real and you're going to fight
Right.
Frankenstein and things, whatever else it may be. It's about personal horror. It's about personal stories, about psychological horror. It's about experiencing trauma in the perspective of characters and what your characters will do about the situations around you. And that's at the heart what Zweihander is. But it all started with that spark that came from Vagrant Story on PlayStation 1.
That's
That
awesome.
to this day, I replay that game annually around Christmas. I just finished my replay actually in mid-December. I do it every year since it came out.
That is so cool. Like I said, we played the Shadow of the Demon Lord, and you know, I think that my homebrew campaign that I was running had a sprinkle of Game of Thrones, a heavy dash
Mhm.
of The Witcher, a little in fact that our campaign was called The Company, the Golden Bear, so it had like
Mm.
a flavor of the Black Company as well,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, which I mean, I just got done rereading the first book by Glenn Cook
Uh-huh.
again, which is the Black Company, right? And like, man, that it's written so weirdly because it's like
Yeah.
almost like war correspondence from like Vietnam or something like that,
Yeah.
like some soldier's
Yeah.
journal, you know. But talk about a book of like normal dudes just doing what they can. You
Yeah.
know, like they find themselves in these like crazy situations where there's like other beings that are literally raised from the dead,
Yeah.
fighting supernatural things, and then they're like, no, you need to come fight this war for us. And they're like,
Uh-huh.
okay,
It's
okay,
in the language of the OSR, fantasy fucking Vietnam. That's the way that I've heard Black Company referred to. I do you read Berserk at all? Like
No.
the Kitara Miura manga. It's one of the best selling mangas out of Japan. I don't read manga, but I read Berserk, and it's a dark fantasy world. I mean, Dark Horse has been releasing omnibuses of its work over the past like 8 years. It's terribly fascinating. It's a dark analogy to the early like true medieval period of Europe.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it's filled with demons and weird shit, and it's a very horrific story. But it's very fascinating, and it to me, Berserk is like the ultimate Zweihander campaign, because it does represent like all the horrors and terrors in a very, very mature
Yeah.
world, coincidentally, just as mature, if not more so, than Shadow of the Demon Lord. Sometimes done distastefully, but by
Yeah.
design.
Right.
And
Right.
it's excellent. It's excellent.
Hmm. Very good. Very good. Now, earlier in the show, I had said that this was powered by the apocalypse, right?
Mhm.
And which is not the case. You corrected me. This is powered by Zweihander. So, give us maybe you can explain to us like what does that mean, powered by Zweihander?
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the things that the things that we understand about role playing games, there's two things we typically interact with as a player or a game master.
Hmm.
The first piece of UX we interact with is the character sheet, right?
Yeah.
The character we all and the dice, right? And there's something very elemental about the math rocks, right? It's I think as you game over time, you begin to understand the probabilities of rolling a d20.
Yeah.
You know, but for a beginning gamer, like the D20, you just need to know you just need to know your roll high, but it's hard to make choices because you don't know how to wager. You don't know like what your
Right.
chance for success is. So Powered by Zweihander is all percentile based. I love
Hmm.
percentiles because
Me too.
one, they're a very elementary way to understand math. We all know that an 80% is a B, a 90% is an A, 100%
Yeah.
is an A. We know a D is 60% or below. So we know those things inherently because we went to school in America. So I knew that percentiles were going to be the foundation of
Hmm.
of the game system. So it's all percentile based. It's about just interpreting the percentile dice. Sometimes, and it's all roll low. So if you have an 80% chance to succeed, you need to roll 80% or below on your dice. If you
Hmm.
roll 81% or above, you fail, and your chances change based on the situation. But I also wanted to simplify like how criticals are concerned. So as you get better, the higher chance you have to make critical success or failure. So if you succeed, let's say you have an 80% chance to succeed. If you rolled a 77 or a 66 or a
Hmm.
55 or a 44 or a 33 or a 22 or an 11 with matching dice, not only
Yep.
do you succeed, you critically succeed.
Nice.
But if you rolled a 88 or a 99 or a 100, it's a crit
Critical
failure.
fail.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you can always interpret your odds right then and there. Nothing's hidden behind the screen. The player always knows on
Yeah.
paper in front of them on their character sheet their chance for success, so they can make better informed choices for their players. So the Powered by Zweihander system utilizes that. That is the premise. The premise is simple dice mechanics, but easy to learn. But like all great RPGs, hard to master,
Yeah.
in the sense that there are a lot of permutations how those dice are used, different abilities for each of the professions in the game, and there's 94 professions in the base book of Zweihander. In the starter kit, there's 13. You choose one
That's awesome.
and build it, and you get to build a character from the ground up. There's no pre-gens. You actually build a character because that's
Nice.
part of the process of understanding Zweihander. So another premise of Powered by Zweihander is the random character generation. I think oftentimes when we play a new game, like I'm gonna play, like as an example, I'm gonna go play Fantasy Age. What I'm probably gonna play the same character I played in D&D and Pathfinder and every other game
Right.
that I've played because I like playing elven archers. So that's the common experience for a lot of people who play RPGs. So instead, Zweihander says, roll everything randomly from the ground up.
Yeah.
And that's a hard pill to swallow because
It
people are
can be
like,
very much so.
yeah, but
Yeah.
but but the way I look at character creation in Zweihander is that you end up with some really weird combinations. I'll give you a good example. One person rolled a gnome who was a prostitute and had been gelded. And their personality traits were charity and martyrdom. And they're like, how does this all fit together? Because I'm actually like a 5'2" gnome
Yeah.
with gray hair and I'm 32 years old. So you end up with this really weird kind of mishmash of stuff. And I
Yeah.
said, well, think about it this way. A character in Zweihander is like a mosaic. You're going to end up with like all these miscolored pieces that
Yeah.
you generate through percentile dice. You build your character from the ground up. But when you take a step away, you can see the portrait it makes. And then you can
Right.
envision how do all these disparate things fit together to create this seemingly random character when you're going through the process. But when you look at it on paper, like I can see how this character has come to be in this weird gaming
Right.
world. And it kind of asks players to trust in the dice just to because character creation is oftentimes the longest choice and
Yep.
longest session zero is always really long because you get analysis paralysis. Zweihander says, don't worry about that.
Get it. Yep.
Just let's actually create a character. Let's experience character creation together because character creation in this sense is like a life path. It tells you
Mhm.
where you started, what your upbringing was, what culture you're from, the inherent trait that is shared among your cultures. You get one trait among like 14 of like not
Mhm.
all elves can see at night, not all dwarves can use axes. Like there's no every culture has like a set of traits, but they only get one that they were
Yeah.
born with. And then you generate your age and your physical appearance in the way that you were prognosticated to die when you turned 11 and your personality traits and all these other compelling things that at first blush they don't make a lot of sense because you may be accustomed to the way you typically create your
Right.
Elven Archer in Fantasy Age or D&D or Pathfinder. But in Zweihander, when you take a step away and you look at your character sheet, because at the top of every character sheet in Zweihander, it's a Mad Lib.
Yeah.
It's a set of 5 sentences that tells a story about your character. You generate all those random things that fill in the blank, and in it asks players trust in the dice, do something you're not necessarily comfortable with, but you'll appreciate the experiences of Zweihander by going through this, and you can actually start the game within 20 minutes as opposed
You know,
to 2
yeah.
hours to create characters in D&D or whatever other system you have.
And then you start your session one another day, right?
Yep.
The thing that I love about that is that people love their backstories, right?
Yep.
Um they love to create their backstories, they love to kind of go into it. But by doing the character creation, you are creating the backstory,
That's right.
because
That's right.
you're sitting here going like, well, how does this fit together? And then all of a sudden you are able to think of experiences or scenarios or past events that would make that gnome charitable
Yeah.
despite like a horrible thing that it went through being gilded, right? Like
Yeah.
or a horrible experience of being a prostitute,
Yeah.
like you kind of work through all of those types of things and your backstory gels itself together without you having to sit down and write a novel from scratch because
Yeah.
you chose like, oh, I've got a horrible secret that I will, don't want my family to know that you choose every single
Yeah.
time you create a character, you know?
And
So,
and and yeah, exactly. And because Zweihander assumes that at character creation, you lived your entire life in this profession.
mm,
But it doesn't mean you're gonna stay in that profession because, like,
yeah,
every good story, like, stories come there's always 3 major arcs in every stage play, same for, like, movies. It's you have the climax denouement, you have, like, this kinda character arc. Zweihander assumes over the length of gameplay, the campaign play, you will gain 3 professions. You'll basically multi-class over time. You may go in this case, you may go from prostitute to militiaman to witch hunter, and the
yeah,
choices that lead to that are actually the story leads you there.
mm,
And then you choose your profession based on what's happened in the story. You may have started your life as, say, a watchman or a laborer, but maybe you end up becoming a mercenary. Maybe you
mhm,
end up becoming a diabolist because something happens in the story. Like the story-based choices actually lead you to your next profession. So, in the length of Zweihander, like over the campaign length of the story, which is typically about 60-ish sessions or more,
oh, wow,
you will gain 3 professions and you will complete your story. And it's less about like my character went through this giant arc from like youth to old age. It's about no, what happened in this slice of moment in this time for this person, just like we see in film. Like
Yeah.
it's about the moment that happens for the character. So the same thing in Zweihander, the Powered by Zweihander game engine assumes you will go in three distinct directions in the course of your story, and that's based on narrative choices. Whatever profession you move into is based on what has happened leading up to the story up to that point.
So one of the things that you talked about is that you found uninteresting, and I kind of agree with you, is the idea that you have a monster that is just basically a bag of hit points, so you just got to hack
Mhm.
on, and at the end of it you calculate all of the experience points and dole them
Yep.
out, that type of thing. The kind of the very minutia of the math of D&D. and
Mhm.
and and to me, a lot of times D&D, if you do experience points that way, it rewards being murder hobos, and you want to just go kill
Yeah.
everything because that's how you get experience points, and leaves a lot of uninteresting thing or very interesting things on the cutting floor because you aren't incentivized to do it. How does leveling up work in Zweihander, and like what kinds of activities are incentivized to
Yeah.
level up? You know?
So I love this line of questioning because I remember asking myself very, very early on in the process, like what incentivizes people to play? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't about how a character levels up. It's like, what do people like about gameplay? And some people I that game with me like the loot aspect. Some people like the role playing aspect. Some people like the story aspect. Some people like
Hmm.
to like gain NPC allies. Some people like to fight. Like there's different reasonings, and I'm a big believer in reward the behaviors that you want to encourage at your table.
Hmm.
So I used to like nickel and dime people with like bonus experience points, like, oh, you did really good role playing, you get this much. But the
Yeah.
reality is that not everybody's a great role player, not everybody's a great tactician, not everybody's very great about like arguing over loot. So
Right.
I was like, the reward mechanic is literally reward points. Reward points are what you get as a player for showing up and playing the game. That's it.
Awesome.
There isn't like a in-game reason to do it. Like experience points are a weird meta mechanic anyway to think about like, what does experience points really mean in the game world beyond the meta narrative? Like
Hmm.
how does it exist with the milieu of a game world? And the answer is there is no answer. A lot of people argue about it endlessly, like, how old do you have to be level 20? It's like, I'm a big
Right.
believer, like, it doesn't matter, you could still be 14 years old and be level 20, because
Right.
that just happens to be about that story at that time in that moment. So instead, Zweihander uses reward points. You show up, you play the game, you have a good time. At the end of it, you get reward points. You unlock something new on your character. Every
Cool.
single game session, you
Interesting.
will unlock a new ability, whether it's
Huh.
a better skill or a new trait or a new bonus to your attributes. You unlock something, and when you unlock 20 things on your character sheet, then it's time to choose a new profession.
Oh, okay.
And you
Okay.
unlock 20 things for that, and you get your final profession. So you get something every game. So you're not waiting for level 2 or waiting for milestone leveling like in D&D. You get something
Yeah.
for just showing up and playing the game, because the most important thing I feel about role-playing games is it's the act of playing the game together as friends.
Yeah.
So I want to reward that no matter what their satisfaction state is, whether it's loot or role playing or allies or whatever. I want to reward the act of actually showing up. One of the hardest things to do in role playing games, like to
Yeah.
schedule a
Right.
game. So Zweihander presupposes the you gain reward points, which in the acronym is RP, which stands
Yep.
for role playing, and
Role
that
playing. I
was my
love it.
clever way
I
to
love it.
thread the needle on experience points, because I just don't like the idea of experience points as they stand. But yeah, reward points is the way to go. It's how you gain rewards, and Zweihander, it's how you work your way through a profession. And once again, you unlock something at the end of every single game session.
I love that idea. Because I mean, a while ago I switched to doing milestone based, which I think is infinitely better than the hard math of experience
Yes.
points and things
Yes.
like that.
Agreed.
And also it helps. Doing milestone based also helps with uh gaming groups that can't always be all together all at the same
Yep.
time, right? So like if somebody misses one session, they're not a full level behind everybody else just because they didn't get those reward points or that
That's right.
experience
That's
points,
right.
right? And so I switched to Milestone. The problem with Milestone is you got to find the good milestone to then give it to them, which
Mm.
sometimes we're like, are we going to level up yet? Are we going to level up yet? And you're like, not yet. And,
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a kind of a carrot and a stick aspect that happens with that milestone
Yeah.
based. But I really, really like the idea that every game session you get to unlock something.
Mhm.
And after a certain amount of times of showing up and being there and playing, then you get to move on with a
Mhm.
new profession or something like that. I think that's a really interesting way of solving that problem. Very,
Yeah.
very innovative, I think. Because like you said, you're trying to reward the behavior that you want, and which isn't necessarily a specific in-game behavior. You're trying to
Uh,
reward the behavior of showing up and playing.
yeah. 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 It's the every meme. Like I love one of my favorite memes to come out of the D&D Honor Among Thieves was when the movie was bumped by like
Uh-huh.
6 months. There's like some meme around like they couldn't even get the party together to launch the movie on time. Like it's just like a D&D game, which I think is utterly brilliant. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's the rewarding the thing that you want to see as players collectively, which is let's all show up and game together.
So you have put out quite a bit of content for Zweihander. I
Mhm.
was just looking at the McNeil Publish and the page that you have there, and there is quite a bit. I mean, you've got obviously the Zweihander revised core rule book for like
Mhm.
the game master. You've got the player's handbook that's out there, but there's plenty of other supplements that you have there,
Yeah.
such as like the main gauche, which as a French speaker I know means left hand,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? So I haven't really looked at that one. And I'm like, what is that? Like what does
Yeah.
I assume it's a alternate weapons and type thing. I'm just taking a guess there.
It's
No, it's
it's
a
about
new profession. It's just a
the left-handed path. It goes into really, really dark
oh, I
territory. If you
like
want
it.
to take your game toward, if
Yeah.
you want to play like evil campaigns, that's the supplement to pick up. It was actually a slush pile we had in our Google Docs for stuff we couldn't include in the revised core rulebook. We called it
Yeah.
Mongosh because Zweihander's a weapon. Mongosh is held in the left hand, and like this is all like
Yep.
left-handed path occult stuff.
I
So
love
but
it.
the revised core rulebook, quick clarification, the revised core rulebook actually is inclusive of the player's handbook, the dungeon master's guide, the monster manual, and an adventure. It's everything you need. The player's handbook is actually
Wow.
just the player's handbook is just the first 10 chapters of that book that we did later, just to
Oh,
have like
okay.
a
All
smaller
right.
book.
Great.
Yeah, so you can literally play it just the revised core book. It literally has a fully baked monster manual, everything else you need inside of it. It's like 687
You
pages. It's huge.
Oh, that is hefty. That is definitely a Zweihander book right there.
Two-handed.
Yeah,
It weighs 5 pounds. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. Now there's also a lot of other supplements that you can get. There's arcane magic cards, covenant magic cards, divine magic cards. You've got a game master folio, a screen, monster cards, those types of things that if you wanted those to play with. There's the American Gothic horror of Flames of Freedom that is
Yeah.
like based powered by Zweihander, right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
again, I told you before, I'm most interested in starter sets for the reasons that we talked about already. So why don't you walk us through your starter set? Because this just
Yeah.
released, I think, within the last month, right?
Yeah, so it came out late November.
Okay,
And
so it's been about
it's
2 months.
yeah, this is the starter kit. Quick aside for the audience, the starter kit, and this was not intentional, by the way. I swear on everything that's holy. This starter kit, if you put it on a scale, weighs 66.6 ounces. It's true. If you hit the tear, whatever the button is on your
Yeah.
scale, your food scale, it weighs 66.6 ounces. It was not intentional.
Oh my gosh,
But
it's too funny.
yeah, so Zwinder comes out in 2018, and it's been, we've had a lot of feedback from the community. A lot of people
Yeah.
have played it. We made a lot of improvements in my own game table, and we knew that we wanted to maybe do a second edition, but I didn't want a re-edition. I'm kind of anti re-editioning because I don't want to invalidate
Okay.
the purchase that people have made before. So I was like, what if we took all the lessons we've learned in the past 4 years, we put it in a
Mhm.
starter kit, and we make it usable for new players, and we also make it backwards compatible with the book line, and make the old book line forwards compatible with the starter kit, so it all works together. So we decided to thread that needle, and we ended up creating the starter kit. And when I started actually defining the scope of work for the starter kit, I knew I needed to do a couple things. One, I wanted a kick-ass adventure that delivered on like all the occult horror themes, like the art occult horror. I just watched Suspiria, and I was like the original Italian movie, and I was deeply fascinated with that. I love Twin Peaks and I love small town horror. So I was like, I'm going to talk to James Introcaso, who wrote in D&D and now works for MCDM, to like write the adventure. And he wrote the adventure inside the starter kit. But I also wanted to make sure that the starter kit had content in it that would not be simply shelved and thrown away. Give you a good example. The D&D Essentials kit, the D&D Stormrack Island kit, the D&D starter kit. Those are great box sets. Right. But once they're done, they're on your shelf. You never pick them up again. I wanted everything in the starter kit to be evergreen, meaning you could take this content, the cards, the screen, the red book, the black book, the maps, all the character sheets, everything inside there is usable with the revised core rulebook. It meaning you don't just shelf this thing, you carry this content forward into your game. The red book, in fact, inside the starter kit right here, is the only thing players will need if they play Zweihander for 10 years until they want to change professions or get new spells. This book can be used for literally everything, and it's a hyper-condensed version of the revised core rulebook, and it's 100 pages long. So you can use that. You could literally, as a player, you could buy a starter kit and never have to buy a single book in your entire life. All you need is a game master as the revised core rulebook when you want to change professions or get more spells. This otherwise has every single rule you will ever possibly need in Zweihander inside of it as a player. So I wanted this to be like the thing that players could take forward into their normal game. But it also has a ton of maps and posters inside of it too. So I wanted like there to be, there's like a 2x3 like map of the small city where the adventure takes place in Swansea. That was illustrated by Kyle Latino. But I wanted to also keep the same illustrator on board, Dejan Mandic. He lives in Serbia. I've been working with him since like 2014. He's done all the illustrations in the entire Zweihander game line on the inside. He has a very characteristic style. It's all black and white. It's all done by hand, no digital work. He illustrates all of our books cover to cover. Well, I should say interior to interior. The covers are typically done by a different artist. In this case, the cover for the starter kit was done by Samuel Arrea, who's like a brilliant artist. But I wanted the starter kit to like deliver on those two things, and most importantly, I wanted to make it super cheap. So I created this, or say we collectively created this with a crack team of writers. So Anna Goldberg, Sean Van Dame, Kate Bullock, James Tricasso, myself, a handful of contributors. Sorry about that. I coughed. The team from Grim Perilous Studios, who I game with. And we created this starter kit, and it's been incredibly well received, which was great. It's always a gamble to relaunch a game, because the perception could be, oh, they're re-editioning, so all my old stuff is no longer applicable. We kind of took a page out of Free League's book when they created their starter kit for Tales from the Loop. It updated the rules, but it was still backwards compatible. So we did the same thing for the starter kit. And keep in mind, the starter kit came out
very cool
in 2022. So that's 4 years after the main line rulebook came out. So we listened to our community. We included our errata. We, got a lot of feedback from our Discord, a lot of feedback from our Facebook page. We had a lot of community feedback to help us kind of shape and create this thing into a game as a product that we thought would not only satisfy Zweihander players, because the first rule of creating games is to your community is do no harm, just like a doctor. But more importantly, how do we create Zweihander to be a more inclusive and easier, lower barrier to entry experience? Because the Zweihander book is 687 pages and very intimidating. It's huge. So we created the starter kit, and like I spoke about earlier, my favorite things about AD&D second edition was boxed kits. The things I loved about box kits from AD&D during the TSR days we included. So all the physical ephemera, all the tear apart tarot sized cards for injuries and spells and clues, all the 8.5 by 11 maps, all the big full out 2.5 by 3 maps, the posters, the feel, the saddle stitch books, the color choices were influenced by the red box from AD&D and the black box for AD&D as well. Like I carried those things forward into this and also gave it like a super sturdy box with beveled edges. I wanted the box to actually not be able to be crushed on the shelf. So you can kind of see it
Nice.
here in the camera. It's
Yep.
beveled.
Yep.
But it's a very, very sturdy box because I love the Pathfinder beginner box, how sturdy their box was. It imparts value
Yeah.
to a consumer. It's something that we were taught by our book buyers, like that we should skew on quality of product, which is one thing we've always stood by with our Zweihander game line. So the starter kit, it started at in 2020, like late 2020. We wrapped it up in 2021. It went to the printer in January 2022 and delivered at the end of 2022.
That's
And we did a
pretty
little,
amazing.
yeah. It's the last game I worked on at Anders McNeil before I left. It's the one I'm probably the most proud of because I finally got to create a starter kit, which was kind of my pipe dream for many, many years.
Yeah.
And I just saw today, and it literally almost brought me to tears. This parent, she's 41 years old. She tagged me on Twitter and she said her 15-year-old son and her husband were playing their first RPG, and it was the starter kit. And I
Oh,
was
that's
like,
awesome.
how fucking cool is that? Like,
Yeah.
I remember picking up my first boxed kit, and one of my first box kits was like the Planescape box kit, and that was such an instrumental part of my youth. The red box was for AD&D, like that was that was part of my experience, and I look back on that in fondness, and it's incredible to think that like this box kit that my team and I collectively created is the first game these people are ever going to
Yeah.
play, and how cool is that? Like I can it's just weird. It's still so weird to think about. Like I can go to Target down the road and find this sitting beside the D&D Essentials kit. I can walk into Barnes and Noble and find the same set. I can walk into my local gaming store and I'm just what a privilege it is to have the opportunity to create something like this, to re-author a book that I literally almost wrote on my own way back when with a guy named Tanner Ye, the original Zweihander. Like to be able to rewrite this with a team of like experienced writers and a great artist using all these learnings from our community to make this like really tight, cool game package. And now for it to be like so well received, it's truly been a blessing. It's strange to think about. I have no illusions. I try to remain humble, but God, it feels really good to know people are like playing this thing and they can enjoy the game that I love, that I play at my young
Yeah.
game table, and this may be their first game they can play. I mean, it's just wild to think about.
It's well deserved. Very well deserved. And we have like a billion things, I'm sure, like that we could continue to talk about for hours and hours and hours. But one thing I kind of wanted to wrap up on, and you touched a little bit, is that you recently did leave Anders McNeil
Mhm.
Publishing. You kind of made an announcement on your Discord that
Yeah.
like mid to end December. So what is it? What's next? What's happening?
Well, I can't talk too much about it openly yet.
Okay. Okay.
I will say it was kind of a mutual decision to
Hmm.
depart Andrews McNeil. They're still my publisher. I still work with them almost on the daily. They're a great company to work for, but I've got I had to get off the train and go to my next stop. My
Yeah.
next stop I'll probably be talking more about in February.
Okay.
I've kind of got 3 specific things I'm working on right now, 3 directions. I have to pick who I want to bring to the proverbial dance, so to speak. But I will tell you this: whatever choice I make, it will wherever the direction I end up going will be to support Zweihander, the community that has initially believed in me back in 2016, and now believes collectively in us, the freelancers and artists and writers and editors and designers that I work with. Where I end up going will continue to service Zweihander, continue to service the community, and this is not the last thing you'll see from Zweihander, not only just in
Awesome.
2023, but 2024 and onward. I'm very
Awesome.
excited for
We
the
can't
future.
Yeah, I cannot wait to see what happens. I love everything that we've seen, and to be perfectly honest, I had not gotten the starter set myself. I've got plenty of collection on the shelf over
Uh-huh.
here. Zweihander's not on there, but it will be on Wednesday, so I
Well,
just picked it up.
oh,
So
that's great. I was gonna say I will be more than happy to mail you a
oh,
copy
no,
with
no.
Amazon.
For the cost of $25, I can pick this up, right? So, um, I encourage my listeners to go out and also check it out. Again, any starter set that's got everything that you have in there, right? Which is all those books, you got the maps, you got the game master screen, you've got the cards that you can use, and these are all very reusable products,
Yeah.
right? That you can do for $25 is a steal. I don't know how you're making money on it, if at all. I joked about that with Mike Mason when he was selling his starter set for like $20. I'm like,
Yeah.
you can't be making money on this.
Well,
Like,
I'll I'll
so,
I'll I'll tell you this, we're in our second print run already. So
oh wow.
it's yeah, it's truly it's a blessing. Truly it
Yeah.
is.
So I'm excited to get it, and I'm definitely going to show it off at our next Geek Week that we have on the show,
Very
because
cool.
I'm excited to dig into it. My last question for you is community content.
Mhm.
Like what kind of community content is there, or do you encourage it? Like what uh what's your stance on it, given the recent developments of the OGL?
We were kind of ahead of it back in 2016 because Zweihander is released under Creative Commons license,
Yeah.
non-commercial. So you can actually create whatever the hell you want, do whatever you want with it. That was that way initially when I released it on Kickstarter. We also have a community content library with Drive-Through RPG called the Grow Imperialist Library. Adam Rose and his team at Grow Imperialist Studios run that, but
Mm,
it's a very well rounded out library of around like 375 products. People create adventures, they create monster cards, they create VTT content, but it's all Creative Commons license. So you can take it there, you can monetize it. You can do print on demand, which a lot of community
yeah.
content programs don't do. And it pays 60% of revenue, not 50%.
There you
It's
go.
something that Adam and Groom Imperialist really wanted to encourage
Yeah.
for the library. And we have a super, super interactive Discord around it. Like we have 3,000 members in our Discord that most of which are actually participants of the community content library. It's at discord.gg/Zweihander. We're a partnered and verified community with Discord. So you can go there, talk about things you're creating on the other community content libraries, because we allow people to translate their Zweihander adventures into D&D adventures and whatever else they want to do for community content. We're not precious about creating things just for Zweihander. We want to see creators flourish. So people will take their D&D adventures, convert them to Zweihander. They'll take their Zweihander
Yeah.
adventures, convert them to D&D, and we actively encourage that because we want people to be able to have the freedom to create. That's the most important lesson, I think, out of this whole OGL kerfuffle, is that the community is what matters the most, the creator
Mhm.
community as well. And I knew very early on when I started writing Zweihander, I wanted to be creative. I wanted to be under Creative Commons licensing. It continues to
Mhm.
be under Creative Commons licensing, and I'm actually going to open up that license even wider. I'm going to open up that aperture a little bit larger here soon too, so it'll be wholly inclusive, and not just for Zweihander, but also for other people who want to port those things into their own games that are maybe D&D or maybe Pathfinder or whatever else. Maybe we end up adopting the ORC license. We'll see how that turns
Mhm.
out.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like we don't want to prohibit or limit people from creating things using Zweihander, and that's why it's under Creative Commons license.
And really what you're doing is you're taking the idea that a rising tide floats all boats, right?
Yes,
That, like, if
absolutely.
there's a lot of content
Absolutely.
coming out and everybody's playing it and excited about it, it just lifts everybody up, right?
Absolutely.
Instead of being a zero sum game where, who gets the biggest slice of pie type of thing, right? So there's enough pie for everybody
Yeah.
when we're playing.
One
So,
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing we've learned, I think, in the last like 2 weeks is that we're all in this together.
yeah,
Um, Hasbro underestimated that. They underestimated the community, the power of the community. Paizo once again has come out and made created a second revolution
yeah,
in the RPG industry with the ORC, first with Pathfinder, now with the ORC. The community continues to show that they understand RPGs far better than Hasbro suits, whoever those people may be, and we're better for it. And rising tide, like you said, rising tide lifts all boats, and
Yeah.
that's what we want to see with Zweiners. What we want to see with other RPGs. We're not in competition with anybody. We're all in it
Yeah.
together. We're all making games, and at the end of the day, it's about enabling creators to make their things, allow game masters to create their things, and to share it with the world. That's the most important thing to me as a game creator and designer. What I want to see more of in our industry.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show. We had such a good
Yeah,
conversation. Like I
yeah.
said,
Thank you. I appreciate it.
we could have been going on for another couple hours, I think. But you need to go home. You need to go back and watch The Last of Us tonight.
Yeah.
So
I told my wife I'll be there like 10:30 or 11. Like it's like 10:11 now. I'm like, maybe 10:30 or 11, but I think this is going to be a long conversation with Justin. We have a lot to talk about. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you're welcome back anytime. Anytime you've got something big coming out, let us know. We'd love to have you back to talk about it for sure.
Cool.
So
Sounds
yeah,
good.
very good. Well, thank you so much to all of our listeners who stuck with us through this, and we hope you really enjoyed hearing from Daniel and hearing about Zweihander. In case you hadn't heard about it before, so where Daniel, where can they find you? Like on Twitter, social media, that type of thing.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at just /Zweihander RPG, or just come to our Discord.
Okay.
It's just discord.gg/Zweihander. All of our artists and developers and writers and community content creators and fans are there, cussing and discussing new stuff for play testing for
Yeah.
another Zweihander thing we're working on. We're sharing with the community. Come there, interact with us. We're all interactive day by day with the community there. So if you have any questions about the rules, want to share your stories, or are looking for a group, where that's the
Yeah.
place to be. We'll help you out.
Awesome. And for our listeners and folks on YouTube, we'll put that in the comment section so you can just click on that link and it'll take you right to the Zweihander Discord group. So, yeah, again, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us tonight. And as always, keep the dice rolling. Have a great night, everybody.
Happy gaming, everybody.